হয়েছে, ঠিক হয়েছে। পড়ে যাচ্ছে, পড়ে যাচ্ছে। না, পড়ে যাচ্ছে। ছাড়েন। Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, all our special guests and honorable speakers. On behalf of Cosmos Foundation, let me welcome you to a very important and timely dialogue on fake news and hate speeches, causes and consequences, how it subverts our democratic system. And this will be our first distinguished speaker series. Bila Rahman, and I would personally like to thank each of you for taking the time to attend this extraordinary gathering, especially our distinguished speakers and panelists. It has been very important for Cosmos Foundation to organize the dialogue series as we continue to grow and adapt. Some of you will have already attended previous installments on various issues ranging from relations between Bangladesh and the European Union, Bangladesh and India, Bangladesh and China, to the Rohingya, to Baul music and philosophy. And we had the most recent one, which was held on Thursday, April 4th, the Ambassador Lecture Series, Relations between Bangladesh and UK, A Prognosis of the Future. Cosmos Foundation is always open to new ideas that can help transform society and lead to a better future. And your support along this journey is extremely important to us. So without further delay, let me thank each of you for taking the time and for reaching the occasion with your presence. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to the chairman of Cosmos Foundation, Mr. Inayatullah Khan, to deliver the opening remarks. Thank you.
Hello. Assalamu alaikum. Honorable Minister, Mr. Anisul Haq, Member of Parliament, our speaker for today's event, Mr. Dan Shafet, Chairman of the Symposium, Dr. Iftikhar Chaudhry, ladies and gentlemen, a good morning. It gives me great joy to be able to welcome you all. I'm deeply touched by your continued and unflinching support for our endeavors. This is evident by your presence here today. I should especially like to recognize and thank our chief guest, the Honorable Minister, Mr. Anisul Haq, Member of Parliament, whose presence encourages us and inspires us. Cultural and intellectual resources are legendary. It is the aim of the Cosmos Foundation to tap into this vast pool and extricate from it elements that can help us shape in Bangladesh an informed society concerned with the attainment of peace, stability, and prosperity. Our programs are always geared to that end. You will recall recently we introduced our Ambassadors Lecture Series. The initiation was conducted by the Ambassador of the European Union and was followed by the British High Commissioner. Both events were great success, and not just with the way it brought together so many like-minded people, but also the impact it had on the national discourse. Today, I'm particularly happy to announce the commencement of yet another program to complement the earlier one. We have named it as the Distinguished Speaker Series. While the Ambassador Lecture Series is focused on widening and deepening Bangladesh's relations with nations around the world, the Distinguished Speaker Series is designed to enhance our understanding of some key issues that dominate current global debate. Under this program, we hope to invite international personalities to the Cosmos Foundation platform to interact with the Bangladeshi intelligentsia on key current topics. The purpose would be for us to comprehend the ideas that are shaping thought processes around the world. In our view, this will assist Bangladesh in keeping up with the times. I'm absolutely delighted that our first speaker under this program would be Mr. Dan Shafet. He is as cosmopolitan as one can get. He's a lawyer who was born in and educated in Denmark, and today is a household name in European, American, and indeed global legal circles. He's seen widely as a champion of the rights of the individual to remain private, if I might put it that way. In Europe, he has been spearheading a campaign to counter the wave after wave of fake news, not distorting the truth, but also protecting the members of the public from the onslaught of the internet. Once, when giant tech company Google unfairly attacked him, he took it to the court and famously won the case. He the tech giants, including those of the Silicon Valley in America, acquired a degree of untouchability usually reserved for royalties. In Europe, Dan Shafet prepares legislative bills for the French Senate, particularly those pertaining to creation of an internet ombudsman for sanctioning of fake news. He is an influential and prolific writer, and as you will soon discover, an electrifying speaker. It's to have you with us in Bangladesh, Dan, and we eagerly look forward to listening to you. I should be wanting in my duties where I ought to say how beholden I am to our chair today, Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhry, former Foreign Affairs Advisor and now Principal Fellow at the National University of Singapore, for continued and unflinching support to our efforts. His think, the Institute of South Asian Studies in Singapore, is one of the premier research institutions devoted to the study of our region. It has been a privilege at Cosmos to collaborate on a number of joint projects, both in Dhaka and in Singapore. Tech companies should be subject to a compulsory code of ethics to tackle the spread of fake news, harmful contents, and disinformation. We need a radical shift in the power between the platforms and the people. The rights of the citizen need to be established in a statute by requiring the tech companies to conduct review by Parliament and overseen by an independent regulator. Today, from this malicious and relentless targeting of citizens with disinformation and personalized adverts from unidentifiable sources. Social media platforms are failing to act against harmful content and respect the privacy of users. In a few moments, I shall hand over the microphone to Dr. Chaudhry to conduct the symposium, but before doing so, I should like to wish you all a very warm afternoon with us. I would also encourage you to take part in our deliberations, and we will have an interactive session, so feel free to ask questions, identify yourself, and I'm sure that this is going to be a very interesting session for all of us. Now I'd like to hand over the microphone to Dr. Chaudhry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Natul. Honorable Minister, Speaker Dan Shafet, ladies and gentlemen, I should be frankly remiss were I to begin without adequately thanking you, Mr. Minister, for being present here this morning. We are all aware of that you're a person of a very, very sharp legal intellect, and I deem it a privilege to share the podium with you. Your participation also demonstrates the importance that the Bangladesh government accords the subject at hand. The Cosmos Foundation and Chairman Inayatullah Khan deserve high applause for hosting this supremely timely discussion. Our sincere thanks to them. While I myself have dedicated much of my public service to Bangladesh, I have had to spend the last 10 years of my life in the academia in Singapore. That is a country and society that have transformed themselves from the third world to the first in a single generation. They have done so through sheer hard work, discipline, innovative drive, and largely incorruptible social stewardship to become a paradigm of progress worthy of emulation in the region and around the world. Is emerging as a conduit to connect Bangladeshis to the Singapore experience, amongst other things. It is my firm conviction that Bangladesh can leapfrog into progress by learning from those who have gone before and accomplished much like Singapore. It implies, Japanese economists have called it the flying geese model. It implies birds flying in a formation where those behind gather power and speed from those who go in front. That has brought great rewards to the peoples and countries of Southeast Asia and the Far East. Now to turn to the subject of today and to our distinguished speaker. Modern political ethos, some claim, began with the European Enlightenment that was heralded by the Renaissance, the Reformation, the French and the Industrial Revolutions, and even the unfortunate predatory relations that European imperialism had with others. In fact, these phenomena fell into the round of Asia that characterize our present times. Political and social development evolved with the liberty of the individual, including the freedom of speech and writing. A powerful champion of the 17th century England in this respect was the poet John Milton. The golden pages of his work, the Areopagitica, contained strong advocacy for expression of unfettered thought, provided they were not libellous and blasphemous. The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States took it a step forward. However, Western imperial powers ruthlessly suppressed this in the colonies and in China till they flourished luxuriously in the post-colonial world. But then came the rub. The power of free speech to receive and impart information was undermined by the burgeoning of motivated falsity, or fake news, as we now call it. It undermined the truth and goodness that listeners could no longer distinguish signal from noise. As to hate speech, one cannot but recall with horror the unspeakable tragedy perpetrated by the ignoble terrorist in Christchurch, New Zealand. It was fueled by his propensity to be influenced by the anti-Islamic rhetorics of the mindless white supremacists. Into this very complex arena entered tech giants like Google, sometimes with the purpose to dominate. The individual became powerless and even threatened. Lack of delay of action on the part of such platforms led to new technologies like deep fake. Now these are videos, the deep fake, often from these giant entities where peoples are manipulated to say things that they did not. These seem to reflect the rise of the digital Frankenstein, where, like the fiction of the same name by the young Mary Shelley, the poet's wife, where the created spins out of the creator's control. The new giant killers, the champions of individuals' protection from relentless glare of the often unfair focus, thought leaders like our distinguished speaker, Dan Sheffett. I met Dan for the first time at the Tamsin Club in Singapore after a memorable talk by him at the National University of Singapore. I was deeply impressed by the profundity of his ideas and the lucidity with which he expressed them. As you heard, Dad took Google to court and won, famously stating that, and to quote him, the pinnacle of arrogance is indifference. He argued for one right the individual we were to yet hear of. This was the right to be forgotten. Responsible regulators then were spurred into action. In Singapore, we speak now. Singapore is tabling in the parliament legislation entitled Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Bill, and Australia is also acting, as you perhaps aware, post Christchurch. So the merchants of deceit someday would need to be confronted. But make no mistake, it would also be wrong for authorities to use this new idea to curb the rightful speech of the individual. So the great challenge of contemporary governance is to be able to locate the equilibrium. This could perhaps be best done by a careful balance of trust and skepticism, of curiosity, and the capacity to discern the truth from lie. For any society, it is a tough challenge, but we have no option but to pick up the gauntlet. Dan Sheffett will speak to all this and more. I thank you. Dan, you have the floor.
Thank you. And you can speak.
You can speak from the podium, or if you like, or you can speak from here.
I think this one works.
Yes.
I'm going to confuse everybody by walking around.
Yes.
My first time in this country, and I hope it won't be the last. Dear colleague, I understand that you have been very active as a criminal lawyer in this country, outstanding criminal lawyer, and now Minister of Justice. And you will have to look at regulation on the subject that we're talking about today, which is absolutely essential, not only to your work, but to the work of your colleagues today in other countries. But I want especially to thank you, NAED, for organizing this. Really an extraordinary initiative, and we're very pleased that the association that I preside, the Association for Accountability and Internet Democracy, has NAED as a member of our board. Could I ask you please to give a round of applause to NAED? Thank you. I'd like to ask you all a question, and we could have a long debate on that, so let's have some quick answers. Do you think that democracy is a human right? What is our friend from Halliburton saying?
No comment.
Today, so don't worry, you know. So people tend to agree that democracy is a human right? Well, it may be to a certain extent debatable, but the Universal Declaration does at least talk about it as a human right in Article 21. And the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR, also. Now, let's just remember that it is most probably a human right. And let's see how that interacts with the internet. I've been working for over 10 years on what is called content regulation. Content regulation today includes fake news, but that was really not the problem when I started working on that 10 years ago. The problem that I started working on it 10 years ago, and actually wrote a report on that subject for UNESCO, was terrorism, radicalization. That was the buzzword. Everybody was talking about that 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and they still are. But of course, fake news is the big problem today, which is a kind of terrorism against the human right that we call democracy. Now, let's just look at why radicalization, terrorism, fake news, and hate speech have attracted so much attention. Of course, it has to do with the internet. 1996, John Perry Barlow. Do you know what that is? John Perry. Don't cheat. Don't look at your phones. John Perry Barlow was actually a lyricist in a rock band. And in 1996, he wrote the Declaration of Independence number 2. The Declaration of Independence number 2 contains several famous passages. The most important is, "You are not welcome among us." Who are you? Government, right? Cyberspace, the internet, was to create in 1996 a utopia, a paradise. And part of that paradise was that government was not part of the game. No regulation, absolute freedom. Utopia meant absence of regulation. Those were the dreams, those were the thoughts. And in that same year, 1996, we had a law that was passed in the US, which is the Communications Decency Act, also known as the CDA. And you should really look that one up because it is the Bible on which is based the philosophy of John Perry Barlow, Section 230C. Communications Decency Act, Section 230C. This is the legal manifestation of that philosophy, that government should stay away. We have complete freedom on the internet, this new cyberspace. And the Communications Decency Act in that same year, 1996, translated that into law. Congress said that the intermediaries on the internet are not editors and are not publishers. Now, what does that mean? It means that they are not accountable for content. That is really what it means. Why did Congress pass that law in 1996? It's absolutely essential to understand the situation we're in today, right? Well, it wasn't really because of John Perry Barlow. That was kind of like the general philosophical sentiment of the day. There were two court cases. One was a court case against a company, a platform called Prodigy, and another one about a company called CompuServe. You probably all remember the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio, The Wolf of Wall Street. Remember that? Right? Now, DiCaprio, he was actually the bad guy in the Prodigy case. Oakland Stratum was the name of a company which actually lost a lot of its market value because of this platform called Prodigy gave information that was probably wrong about certain activities that took place in the company, and that was deemed to be manipulation of the stock market. And Prodigy, the platform, was held accountable for that information. All right? So the platform was responsible for the false information that led to a financial disaster of a third party. The same was almost the case in the CompuServe case. And Congress simply said, if we don't regulate this, if we don't say that platforms or intermediaries on the internet are not liable for content, then we'll have class action suits, we'll have SEC investigations, FTC, Department of Justice, everything. And this little body that we cherish very much, which is the internet, right? That was, again, 1996. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it will become. We think it will become something big. We have to protect it. So this, I think, is important for everybody in the room to understand. This is how the whole problem that we have today started. All right? Coming from this utopic philosophy, passing a law which is based on two court cases, and this philosophy, and some good legal reasoning. This is the absolute immunity provision that still applies in the US. We have two in the US that award absolute immunity. And I just mention them so that we all understand that it's very, very rare to have such laws. The other law is the law of distribution of weapons, of handguns. The of handguns in the US is not liable for distribution of those guns. absolute immunity. There's a very important case right now. You probably remember the Sandy Hook case. As far as I recall, it was 29, or maybe it was 21, that were killed. The case started up against Remington, who produced this assault rifle, and Remington, of course, invoked the benefit of the absolute immunity. At that particular point, now the case is back again, because the victims had a really good lawyer, and he identified that maybe the misleading advertising that was made by Remington's actually instigated or incited the use of guns, and that may have been another basis of attacking the manufacture of the weapons. And the third is vaccines, right? The manufacturer of vaccines cannot be held accountable for what may be the side effects of vaccines. I think it's is one of those three laws and how exceptional that is. The situation we have today, of course, was completely unpredictable in 1996. But what happened is that, unfortunately, the disinhibition effect, as we call it, the mere fact that we are and that we can say, that's debatable, that we can say and share our worst feelings to a lot of people who may or may not share our convictions, but at least we do that, have caused the worst to come out in mankind and not the best. And that is the mistake they made in 1996. That is where John Perry Barnes, philosophers, or a guy called Lanier, said the same. They believed that the internet would make us better people. They believed it would probably change the way we are as humans. But of course it didn't. Of course it didn't. So now, just last week, Mark Zuckerberg, imagine, he called for regulation. He did the opposite of what they did in 1996, where they said that regulators, you're not. He said, please. Now, why does Mark Zuckerberg say that? Why does Facebook now call for regulation? Well, first of all, they have a lot of bad press these days, right? Really bad press. It may the stock market. I mean, when Cambridge Analytica came out, the share dropped 17%. It then went up again, but that's really bad news. My theory, unfortunately, is a bit simple. I believe that what Facebook is actually looking at right now, when they're calling for regulation, is not for the right reasons, but actually to an extent replicating what we saw in 1913 happened to AT&T, right? AT&T found out, and that actually started in 1910, entered in 1913, that the monopoly, as Vail, the CEO, called it, and some competitors were popping up all over the country, especially in long-distance calls, and that's where AT&T made a lot of money. And what's more efficient when you are a de facto monopoly and you see competitors popping up? What is more efficient than asking government to run you as a monopoly? In other words, creating a legal monopoly where you own, until that point in time, an economic monopoly. That is what happened. There's the so-called commission from 1913, which describes this in detail, and it AT&T to have a monopoly, both economic and legal, for 70 years on telecommunications in the US. I'm a bit cynical when I say that I believe that in reality that is what Facebook is asking for now. They are not asking for regulation to do the right thing. They're asking for regulation to protect themselves against competitors, against disruptive technology. I hope I'm wrong, but we should learn from history. And this didn't the good and the bad part what we call the gatekeeper problem today on the internet. The internet was, of course, to have this decentralized system. And that was supposed to be inclusive and giving each and every one in this room empowerment to change. And Tim Lee, as we know, who is really the father of the web, has become so frustrated, to put it mildly, with the fact that the internet has become centralized and not decentralized, that he actually taken steps to create a web, which he calls solid. And I'm very pleased that we are part of the Web Foundation initiative, which he has created, on promoting a truly decentralized internet. But for the time being, we don't have that. For the time being, we have like a handful of players that control everything that's going on. Google, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, and to a certain extent Apple. Apple's philosophy is a bit different. And what happens when we get content like radicalization, terrorism, fake news, sex trafficking, all the terrible things that goes on, is of course that unfortunately these gatekeepers, they don't fulfill their role as gatekeepers. There are theories as to why they don't do that, and probably it has to do with the business model of the internet. And if we want to do something about fake news and hate speech, we have to address that business model. We have to address that business model by regulation, and we have to address that business model also by economic initiatives, and I'll get back to both of them. Now, we are within NIA and the most important media group in this country, and I think that it would be very pertinent even to recall that media law, which developed over the centuries, has created a system of accountability for the editor or whoever it is. Remember that the law from 1996, the Communications Decency Act that I mentioned first, says that the intermediaries are not editors and are not publishers, which means that they are not accountable under these laws. But the newspapers, the broadcasters, I mean, you could probably have severe problems if deliberately you have a system of disseminating fake news in your news media, and you should be accountable for that. But the gatekeepers on the internet are not, and I explained why they are not. Now, the content regulation efforts that I would now concentrate just a bit on are, first of all, those that we've seen in Germany and in France, and then I'll mention some others, because what we have done, especially in Europe, is to address this gatekeeper problem and ultimately the business model problem from a fundamental point of view, and not come in and say, we need a law on fake news, we need a law on hate speech, we need a law on sex trafficking. Like, by the way, in the US, they passed a law on sex trafficking, the so-called SESTA law. What we're trying to do in Europe is to attack the problem from a more fundamental perspective. So what we did was, in year 2000, the European Commission came out with a directive, which is the e-commerce directive. It's interesting because it's just 4 years after 1996, so 4 years after the first law in the US, which gives absolute immunity to the gatekeepers, saying that they're not media, they're not newspapers and the rest of it. People can do and Google, Facebook and the others, not a problem. We in Europe, 4 years after, we came out with what we call relative immunity, not absolute immunity. If you care to look it up, it's Articles 13, 14, 15 of the e-commerce directive. And what we say is that once the gatekeepers have knowledge of the toxic content that they're disseminating, they become responsible if they don't act. That's the way we looked at it in Europe, and it's very important legal point. And it has led to a lot of clashes of a transatlantic nature between Europe and the US. I'll get back to what it means in practice, but I think it's important for everybody to understand this completely different approach to accountability between the US and Europe. We do have specific laws in Europe on fake news and on hate speech, and I won't make this too Eurocentric, which Anna yet said I should not do, but I think it's important to mention these two systems. We do have specific laws. I'm not saying we don't have specific laws, but what I said is that the way that we tackle this problem is by a fundamental principle, and it's a principle that applies to all member states of the European Union, including whether or not the UK will Brexit or not. They will still apply the e-commerce directive, and still, just for your information, apply the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. There's no discussion in the UK about that. So, unfortunately, in spite of this regulation from year 2000, where we had a few court cases, we had a Supreme Court case in Germany, we had a Supreme Court case in France, which really loosened up, unfortunately, the responsibility of the intermediary, saying that the nature of the content, the fake news, the incitement, and so on, the sex trafficking, had to be manifest. It had to be clearly illegal. And that brings to a major problem. We talk about fake news, of course. So, unfortunately, this principle is hard to implement in practical cases, but it still is a principle, and we've had court cases like that. The fake news law, maybe in Europe, but certainly in France, I actually drafted that one. And I'm pleased that it didn't pass. Drafted it for the French Senate, and I'm very pleased it didn't pass, because we really did not, this was like 3 or 4 years ago, we really didn't focus on what the real problem was. When Macron was elected, he had a major problem during his campaign. It was that there was this bit of information that he had this secret bank account on the balance. Did you know about that? You probably heard about that. And it even came up at the TV debate which he had with Marine Le Pen from the Front National, the extreme right-wing party in France. She even quoted that bit of fake news on TV in the debate. I mean, that's how far it goes. And he promised that once he would take office, he would take initiative through his Minister of Justice to have a law written on fake news. It went to a member of parliament who was designated to do that. We had lots of discussions as to what would probably be 3 of the most important regulatory challenges when you really want to address fake news. Now let me tell you what here for the Honourable Justice Minister, and then you have this blank sheet of paper in front of you, and you are drafting a law on fake news. Remember that we have a principle that is very important and maybe important human rights, let's put it this way, which is free speech. Free speech is, of course, absolutely essential to political debate. So to the extent we will regulate news of a political nature, we have to bear in mind this free speech principle. So, working on this, what would be the first problem that you would encounter with drafting Article 1? What do you say?
Free speech?
Yeah, free speech is a
if you mean free speech like in Bangladesh, right? You mean local, in Bangladesh. First issue we probably have is maybe it would have something to do with the current maybe government,
Yeah.
the way things are currently operating in Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Maybe could be some of the issues here.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I perfectly right, and understand, of course, free speech. But if you like this, the first challenge you have is, of course, definitions. And we had discussions about that yesterday. How fake news, right? In the European of Human Rights Article 7, and we find that same principle in the ICCPR. We have the so-called principle of legality, right? And my colleague knows that very well as a criminal lawyer. No one can go to prison if there is no law, right? The principle of legality, which is also in some people's mind a concrete manifestation of the rule of law. So we need to be very, very precise, otherwise we'll be violating the rule of law and we'll be violating a human right as embodied in Article 7. What is fake news, right? Because we want to put sanctions for of something. Now those sanctions may be against the author of the fake news and or the gatekeeper. Problem with defining fake news is that it looks pretty simple because what's fake is the opposite of what's true. Okay, fine. But if you look at the fake news that is a real problem to democracy, the true fake news that is a problem to democracy, it's not the fake news. It is the fake news based on fact. Do you understand what I say? It is the from facts to fake conclusions. That's the dangerous fake news. That is the fake news that really has manipulative power. I was in a country which recently had its presidential elections. Won't tell you which country. It involved. I was representing one of the presidential candidates, and what happened was that this candidate had property in another country in the European Union, and that property was seized by his political opponent on the basis of some charge. I won't go into details. And the judge in that country where the property was seized ordered the seizure, and the political opponent published that all over the press in his country, saying that this court order confirmed that his opponent was corrupt. Right? Now, it's a court order. It was completely misrepresented. Because the actual truth of that was that he obtained a court order through what we call an ex parte injunction. And I won't get into technical details of procedural law here. What I say is that an ex parte injunction or an interlocutory injunction means my defendant didn't even know there was a case, all right? Could happen to anybody in this room. A creditor needs to take a lien on your property, and for various reasons he could do that without actually serving notice on you. Afterwards he has to justify the order he got and pay taxes if it was necessary or justified, but that's a different story. It was an interlocutory injunction, a so-called ex parte injunction, but of course newspapers didn't write that. I mean, that wouldn't sell any newspapers, that wouldn't sell any ads at all. So it is that this presidential candidate was convicted of corruption in another country, and here is the proof. What is really dangerous here is that he was convicted, but only to accept that a seizure of an interlocutory nature should be taken as property. And I could keep on giving you examples of dangerous misrepresentations of truth. Look at investigative journalism. Investigative journalists, what they do is, by definition, they go behind the facts, right? They connect the dots. The dots are facts. And with them, and they arrive at conclusions, which are very, very important for democracy. I mean, no one in this room, I hope, would argue or prohibit investigative journalism. But their conclusions are very often of a speculative nature. And they're very, very, very dangerous, I would even say toxic news that it's very hard to say whether they're fake or not fake. So define fake news, if we really want to do something about it, it's not to say that it's something that's not true. It has manipulative impact. It maybe even has to have an intentional impact. And then it becomes really important to define and complicate it. The second paragraph or article that we will have to address when we are sitting in this room and the minister wants it on his desk tomorrow morning, right, is who will decide? The procedural question, who will decide whether something is a violation of the law or not? Now, the way they have done that in Germany and in France, it actually led the first instance decision to the administration and it to a fast-track court case. Now, you experience, and even you who don't, can very well imagine that with this bit of news, and I'll quote again, Macron has an undeclared account on the Bahamas. That was the news. Does anybody in this room know whether that is true or false? Nobody knows. Nobody can. Right? I mean, to be very, could we owe the in democracy to whistleblowers? And the whistleblowers, and the most famous one, of course, will blow the whistle on something which by definition is not known before. And then you say that fake news is something that can be verified, because that means that you wouldn't allow whistleblowers to blow the whistle, because they are saying something that cannot be verified. And you don't. So, and so, I don't, I want this thing taken that Macron has an account on the Bahamas. Therefore, I can't give the source. What are you going to do as a judge? I mean, no, really, imagine yourself sitting there on the bench. You have no training whatsoever of irreverence, because how should you be a sociologist? Should you be a sociologist, a historian, a banker? In any case, your decision is absolutely key as to the results of the elections. Indeed, he had an account in the Bahamas. And again, nobody can know. By saying that we're just replacing a problem and not solving it because we're just putting it on the judge's desk doesn't do anything. Absolutely essential to the procedural question, who decides? Now, procedure. We have Article 6 of the Convention, which is due process. If someone puts up the news that Macron has an account, you want to defend yourself, right? That's the you want whether you can or not disclose your source. Why do you believe that this is true? So, part of the trial, if you're served, if you cannot appear, it's a violation of due process. And what appeal should you be able to appeal the case, which actually you should, as a human right. And the execution, in other words, if the appeal takes 1 year, would the news be up there for 1 year, or would it be done immediately? I'm just describing some of the questions that we deal with when you look at, in actual fact, how difficult it is to implement laws on fake news. Right? As I mentioned before, one problem is that these utopic visions encountered the frailty, let's put it this way, of the human condition. We are bad. All right? And if we can express our anger, our frustration, our hatred in an anonymous way, that disinhibition brings the worst out in us. So should we now make an obligation, when you have a Facebook account, a Twitter account, or whatever, to produce identity papers or whatever, and give your anonymity? Well, the answer to that, of course, that that would be completely against not only the idea of the internet, but also of the true democratic contribution of the internet, especially in totalitarian regimes. We know that very well, that it has had an enormous impact on bringing justice in totalitarian regimes. But we need to address the question in democratic societies, whether or not the time has come for an obligation on social media and other intermediaries on the internet to insist on ID and in other words, lift the anonymity ban. For two reasons. First of all, that it will, of course, have this inhibition problem. People are suddenly accountable for what they say, right? Which is very, and second, because the internet, which is universal, i.e. the corporation. And if we have time during the Q&A, we could talk about jurisdiction and territoriality because we have 5 minutes left, but it's very important to realize that, of course, the internet being international, what takes place in the US, well, as you all know, to a large degree, that the fake news originated in and I say maybe because the book report is not very clear, so I don't want to take anything. We'll try in a country. So we don't have laws that allow us to obtain the identity of the author of that news in another country, which it would, then it would serve no purpose. So of the problems dealing with fake news. Quickly, because we only have 5 minutes left, and then hopefully we can have Q&A on what happened in France, where, of course, the ministries of justice in those countries did a lot of thinking about the judgment. The law is really the first. The judgment came as a consequence of the sort of that Macron during her election campaign on Facebook, and the tradition of hate speech. Germany is almost allergic to hate speech. What happened during the Nazi regime is something that they will never forget, and they should never forget that. The Germans are allergic to privacy. On the board of where NAS is the Justice Minister in Germany, Sabine Leuthäuser-Schnarrenberger, and she is the idea of fighting hate speech and fake news, and also protecting privacy. And she told me, this is so important for us Germans, is that we experienced 2 totalitarian regimes in 1 century. First the Nazis, and then the Soviet Union. We are completely allergic to hate speech and to privacy violations. So, surprise, the German came out as the first law. The has penalties of 50 million It's a lot of money. 50 million on gatekeepers, which are the intermediaries based on the e-commerce directive from year 2000 that allows it. So if the gatekeepers, once they have knowledge, continue to decide content, I'm using a vague term here, they can be fined up to the tune of 50 million euros. The law over a year, and I know the prosecutor of that law, and I spoke to her just before this session, and she confirmed that so far no fines had been handed down. And I think this room understands why. Because they don't pay, and if they notice that something should be taken down, it proves that we can be efficient if we want to. It proves that we, sovereign states, still today, we will not have tomorrow to fight the tech titans, but we have laws like that. In addition, of course, to paying 50 million euros, is really bad press. The law, which is much more recent, and actually right now there's a hate speech law in France. The fake news, which, as I explained, why quickly after he was elected, the hate speech law is right now being debated. I met with the so-called rapporteur several times on this law, and it started as a law dealing with anti-Semitism, and now it became a hate speech law in general. It contains fines of 50 million euros. It contains fines up to 4% of global. That is a lot of money. Now, 4%? I don't remember the turnover by the way of Google or Facebook, but it's 4% of that. It's global turnover in France, and it's not bottom line. It's global turnover. Why not 5? Well, this is the point. I don't agree with the bill. It will probably be passed in a couple of weeks. The 4% comes in, just for your information, as a compromise that was reached between the European Commission and the tech industry in 2018 when passed law on data protection, the famous General Data Protection Regulation, which entered into effect the 25th of May last year. There were lots of negotiations because initially it was 5%. Tech community obtained that it was 4%. I personally see no reason why this compromise that related to a completely different question, which is that of protection of privacy, why it should be the same in a hate speech law and why it should be the same in a fake news law. But we'll see what it is. But it's a lot of money. I only have 1 minute left or something like that, is that I mentioned, and so did you.
30 seconds.
The titans, as I just need a lot of money to fight them. What problems that we have with the internet? In 69, when they played. Does this room know why the moon is not the 51st state? Why does it belong to America? They planted the flag there. Why is it not American territory? What?
Fake news.
1967, the International Treaty on Celestial Bodies was passed. And that treaty said that the celestial bodies belong to all of mankind. That's why the moon does not belong to the US. It's like Hugo Grotius, who wrote the first laws about the high seas. We're going back now to the 16th and 17th century, around the same conclusion. Cyberspace belongs to everybody, not to one single country. The consequence of that, unfortunately, today, because we don't have such a treaty of on the cyberspace, maybe we will have one, but we certainly don't have one today. The consequence is that we are getting still around cyberspace as we have nations. It's the consequence is the opposite of saying that it belongs to all of us. In this have their own laws, and so on and so forth. 5 different nations have their own laws, split the internet in their own sovereign state jurisdiction. Sovereign state philosophy goes to the 30-year war in Europe, 1648. That's how old it is. And this clash of jurisdictions becomes increasingly difficult and important to deal with. Because the make is that we will impose on fake news and on hate speech. What happens when that toxic content originates in another country? We saw US elections and we will keep on seeing it. How do we make somebody in another country accountable for what happens in our country? Is the same as corruption? Because we have cases before between Canada and US, for example, on pollution, saying that yes, indeed, you can be accountable for what is caused by your factories when they cross the border. Yes.
You have one more.
We're going to be faced with this eternal and recurrent promise that it's so easy. You just do it from another country. So, Minister, start tomorrow morning.
Thank you very much. Yeah. That was spoken. So Chief Guest, Honorable Minister, to give an introduction.
Mr. I have no just in the we have and and he was a and was a clerk and confidant of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. He and in 1973, his father was appointed for the crown during the 1971 war. Case and the James case. It was complete of this country. Was also the chief prosecutor for the Anti-Corruption Commission. And his Supreme Court for and the country over past 40 years. Now, Sani Haq.
will be provided the day after tomorrow, and you'll speak from the roster, Minister? Okay. Minister, floor.
বিসমিল্লাহির রহমানির রহিম। এটা চলে না। অনটন আছে নাকি?
Because of this. I think this is on, so that's why maybe. Yeah, okay. You want this one? Yeah, okay.
Deprive the chair of his mind.
এখন হ্যাঁ,
I hope you'll take note of that.
কপিরাইট।
Please switch off your mic, handphone or switch it off on silent mode, please.
Fake news and hate speech, causes and consequences. How subverts our democratic systems. শীর্ষ আলোচনায় সরকারি ইনস্টিটিউট অফ এশিয়ান স্টাডিজ এর সম্মানিত প্রিন্সিপাল রিসার্চ ফেলো distinguished speaker, Dr. Shepherd, President, Accountability and Internet Democracy, Expert Authority on European and IT Law, the United News of Bangladesh, UNB, the Chief Editor, এবং Cosmos Foundationের Chairman, Dr. Enayatullah Khan, বৃন্দ, আমন্ত্রিত অতিথিবর্গ এবং সাংবাদিক ভাই বোনেরা, নমস্কার, গুড আফটারনুন। দ্রষ্টা বাংলাদেশের জাতির পিতা বন্ধু শেখ মুজিবুর রহমানের প্রতি শ্রদ্ধা ও কৃতজ্ঞতা জ্ঞাপন করছি। প্রতিষ্ঠা ও সুশক্ত করার জন্য শহীদ ভাই বোনের প্রতি বিনম্র শ্রদ্ধা জানাচ্ছি। মুক্তিযুদ্ধকালীন 2 লাখ মা বোনের প্রতি গুরুত্বপূর্ণ এই আয়োজন করার জন্য আন্তরিক শুভেচ্ছা ও সকলকে ইউজ করার জন্য। Opportunity to extend thanks to Mr. Dan Shepherd for the interesting talk on the subject. কোনো শব্দ বা ধারণা নয়, সত্য ও মিথ্যা ব্যবহৃত হচ্ছে যুগ যুগ ধরে। আমাদের মুক্তিযুদ্ধকালে এবং দেশ স্বাধীনতা বিরোধী গোষ্ঠী ছড়িয়েছিল। মানবতা বিরোধী অপরাধের বিচার প্রক্রিয়া প্রশ্নবিদ্ধ করার জন্য তার দেশে ও বিদেশে ফেক নিউজ ছড়িয়েছে এবং তা বিভিন্ন প্রকৃতিতে ছড়িয়েছে। 2 দশকে গণমাধ্যমের প্রকৃতি পরিবর্তনের সঙ্গে সঙ্গে ফেক নিউজের প্রকৃতিও পরিবর্তিত হয়েছে। গণমাধ্যমের প্রকৃতি পরিবর্তন, ফেক নিউজ প্রচারের ধরন পরিবর্তন হয়েছে। শুধু ট্রেডিশনাল সংবাদ মাধ্যম নয়, সংবাদ মাধ্যম এবং সামাজিক যোগাযোগ মাধ্যম ফেসবুক, টুইটার বা ইউটিউবের মাধ্যমে ভিডিও বা স্পিচ ছড়িয়ে পড়ছে এবং এর প্রতি আস্থা ও বিশ্বাস স্থাপনের জন্য বিভিন্ন কৌশল অবলম্বন করা হচ্ছে। বিষয় বিশেষ বিশেষ ব্যক্তির কণ্ঠস্বর নকল করে ভুল তৈরি করে প্রচার করা হচ্ছে। প্রতিষ্ঠিত ও সংবাদমাধ্যমগুলোর ওয়েবসাইট নকল করে তার মাধ্যমে ফেক নিউজ, হেট স্পিচ ছড়ানো হচ্ছে। ফলে সাধারণ পাঠক এই ফেক নিউজ থেকে বিভ্রান্ত হচ্ছেন। লক্ষ্য করা হচ্ছে কেউ সুপ্রতিষ্ঠিত প্রতিষ্ঠানের লোগো যুক্ত করা হয়ে থাকে। ওই প্রতিষ্ঠান মনে বিভ্রান্ত হচ্ছেন। বিভ্রান্তির ফলে অনেক ক্ষেত্রে সাম্প্রদায়িক, জাতিগত, ধর্মীয় ও ছড়িয়ে পড়ছে দেশে বিদেশে। দেশে প্রধানত 5টি উদ্দেশ্যে ফেক নিউজ চর্চা করা হয়। 1. সাম্প্রদায়িক গুজব ছড়ানো। 2. উগ্র রাজনৈতিক ধর্মীয় মিথ্যাচার প্রচার। 3. রাজনৈতিক প্রতিপক্ষকে ঘায়েল করা। জনমত মনে আতঙ্ক সৃষ্টি করা এবং অবৈজ্ঞানিক জল্পনা কল্পনা প্রচার করার জন্য। এক্ষেত্রে শেষের ফেক নিউজে কারো বড় রকমের ক্ষতি না হলেও অন্যান্য ধরনের ফেক নিউজে সহিংস প্রভাব পড়ে জনজীবনে। আমরা এর স্পষ্ট উদাহরণ দেখেছি 2012 সালে কক্সবাজারের রামু বৌদ্ধ পল্লীতে। সেখানে কি ধরনের তাণ্ডব চালানো হয়েছিল। 2013 সালে পাবনার সাঁথিয়া উপজেলার বনগ্রাম বাজারে এবং 2016 সালে ব্রাহ্মণবাড়িয়ার নাসিরনগরে কিভাবে ভয়াবহ হামলা চালিয়ে নিরীহ নিরাপদ মানুষের বাড়িঘরে ভাঙচুর, অগ্নিসংযোগ, লুটপাট করা হয়েছিল তা ভুলবার নয়। 2018 সালে রাজনৈতিক হীন স্বার্থ হাসিলের জন্য কিভাবে কোমলমতি শিক্ষার্থীদের নিরাপদ সড়ক আন্দোলনের মাধ্যমে রাস্তায় নামিয়ে দিয়ে ঢাকা শহরকে অচল করে দেওয়ার ষড়যন্ত্র করা হয়েছিল সেটাও আমাদের মনে আছে। ফেসবুক, টুইটার, ইউটিউব ইত্যাদি সাংবাদিকতা বহির্ভূত যোগাযোগ মাধ্যমে ভুয়া খবর প্রচারের বড় বিপদের দিক হল এসব প্ল্যাটফর্ম থেকে মিথ্যা ও ভিত্তিহীন তথ্য অতি দ্রুত গতিতে সংবাদ মাধ্যমগুলোতে ছড়িয়ে পড়ে। এক্ষেত্রে সবচেয়ে বিপজ্জনক হচ্ছে অনলাইন সংবাদ মাধ্যমগুলো, যাদের অধিকাংশই তথ্যের সত্য মিথ্যা খতিয়ে দেখে না। তাদের দ্বারা যে কোনো চাঞ্চল্যকর ভুয়া খবর মুহূর্তের মধ্যে ভাইরাসের মতো ছড়িয়ে পড়তে পারে পুরো সংবাদ মাধ্যমে। বাংলাদেশ সহ অনেক দেশের মূলধারার সংবাদ মাধ্যম এখন সংবাদের প্রাথমিক উৎস হিসেবে ফেসবুক, টুইটারও ব্যবহার করে। কাজটি দায়িত্বশীলতা ও পেশাদারী দক্ষতার সঙ্গে করলে ঝুঁকির আশঙ্কা কম থাকে, কিন্তু অধিকাংশই অনলাইন সংবাদ মাধ্যম তা করে না। ফলে ভুয়া খবরের পুনঃ ব্যবহার ঘটতে থাকে। সম্মানিত সুধীমণ্ডলী, ফেক নিউজের প্রচার ও প্রকাশ বন্ধে সরকার ডিজিটাল সিকিউরিটি আইন প্রণয়ন, সাইবার আদালত গঠন এবং গুজব প্রতিরোধ ও অবহিতকরণ সেল গঠনের পাশাপাশি অনলাইন নিউজ পোর্টালগুলিকে জবাবদিহিতার আওতায় আনার জন্য রেজিস্ট্রেশনের উদ্যোগ গ্রহণ এবং অনলাইন নীতিমালা প্রণয়নের কাজ শুরু করেছে। ফেক নিউজের প্রচার ও প্রকাশ বন্ধে বিটিআরসি, আইসিটি বিভাগ, পুলিশ ডিপার্টমেন্ট ও সরকারের গোয়েন্দা সংস্থাগুলো কাজ করছে। সরকারের একার পক্ষে এ কাজ সফলভাবে করা সম্ভব নয়। এক্ষেত্রে সরকারের পাশাপাশি মূলধারার সংবাদ মাধ্যমগুলোর গুরুত্বপূর্ণ ভূমিকা রয়েছে। মূলধারার সংবাদ মাধ্যমগুলো বস্তুনিষ্ঠ সংবাদ তৈরি বা দ্রুততম সময়ে পাঠকের কাছে পৌঁছে দিতে হবে, যাতে তারা সোশ্যাল মিডিয়ায় দ্বারস্থ না হয়। সংবাদ মাধ্যমগুলো সত্য এড়ানোর প্রবণতা, নীরবতা থেকে বেরিয়ে আসতে হবে। কারণ আমাদের মনে রাখতে হবে, মানুষের সত্য জানার পথ যেখানে বন্ধ হয়ে যায়, ফেসবুক নিউজের পথচলা সেখান থেকেই শুরু হয়। যে সংবাদ মাধ্যমের প্রতিষ্ঠানের ওয়েবসাইট হুবহু নকল হবে, অপরাধীদের বিরুদ্ধে ব্যবস্থা তাদেরকেই নিতে হবে। সাইট নকলের ক্ষেত্রে যে কোনো প্রতিষ্ঠিত হাউসের আইনি ব্যবস্থাও গ্রহণ করা উচিত। তাছাড়া ফেক নিউজ চিহ্নিতকরণের জন্য নতুন টেকনোলজি ডেভেলপ করা উচিত, কারণ প্রযুক্তি দিয়ে মোকাবেলা করা সমীচীন। ফেক নিউজ চিহ্নিতকরণের জন্য ইতিমধ্যে ভারতে অল্ট নিউজ নামে একটি সফটওয়্যার উদ্ভাবন করা হয়েছে বলে খবর বেরিয়েছে। তাছাড়া সোশ্যাল মিডিয়াগুলোকে জবাবদিহিতার আওতায় আনতে হবে এবং যারা উদ্দেশ্য প্রণোদিত হয়ে ফেক নিউজ তৈরি করে প্রচার করছে তাদের চিহ্নিত করে শাস্তি দিতে হবে এবং তাদের অর্থের উৎস খুঁজে বের করতে হবে। সোশ্যাল মিডিয়া ব্যবহারকারী হিসেবে আমাদের সচেতনতা বাড়াতে হবে। এছাড়া কোনটা নিউজ আর কোনটা ফেক নিউজ এ সম্পর্কেও প্রাথমিক ধারণা রাখতে হবে। আমরা আসলে কী ধরনের লিঙ্ক বা সংবাদ ফেসবুক সহ অন্যান্য সোশ্যাল মিডিয়ায় শেয়ার করছি তা শেয়ারের আগে অন্তত কয়েকবার চিন্তা করে দেখতে হবে, কারণ অসচেতনভাবে হলেও আপনার আমার শেয়ার করা একটি ফেক নিউজের কারণে যে কোনো অঘটন ঘটতে পারে যা আপনি আমি এড়াতে পারবো না। আপনি সজ্ঞানে ফেক নিউজ শেয়ার করলে আগামীকাল যে নিজেই এর শিকার হবেন না তাও বলা যায় না। তাই সামাজিক যোগাযোগ মাধ্যমের কিছু দেখেই গুজব ছড়ানো যাবে না, বরং ধৈর্য ধরে তথ্যটিকে নিশ্চিত হওয়ার জন্য অপেক্ষা করতে হবে। আর আপনি নিজে যদি মনে করেন ফেক নিউজ যাচাই বাছাইয়ের জন্য নিজেকে যোগ্য করে তুলতে পারেননি, তাহলে আপনার গ্রহণযোগ্য মাধ্যমের উপর নির্ভর করাই হবে বুদ্ধিমানের কাজ। তাহলেই ফেক নিউজ পোস্ট কমে যাবে। Before concluding, I must reiterate that for combating fake news, we need getting together on an international level, and technology makes them trans-border crimes. I think dialogue like today's is a very powerful method. আমি আপনাদের মূল্যবান সময় নেব না, আপনারা সুস্থ সুন্দর থাকবেন এই কামনা করছি এবং সকলকে আন্তরিক ধন্যবাদ জানিয়ে আমার বক্তব্য শেষ করছি।
মহোদয়, আপনার এই গুরুত্বপূর্ণ বক্তব্যের জন্য আপনাকে ধন্যবাদ। আপনি ফেক নিউজ কিংবা ভ্রান্তিপূর্ণ বার্তা, তথ্য বার্তা সম্বন্ধে অত্যন্ত বলিষ্ঠ ভাষায় আমাদের আজকের কনটেক্সটে এই ইস্যুসগুলো তুলে ধরেছেন। সরকারের পদক্ষেপ বিষয়েও আমাদেরকে অবগত করেছেন এবং আপনি ঠিকই বলেছেন যে সরকারের সবসময় একাই এটা করা সম্ভব নয় এবং সরকারের সাথে সাথে জনগণকেও সরকারের পাশে থাকতে হবে। So thank you, Minister, for this valuable contribution that you have made. You have made us aware of the various steps that the government is undertaking in this regard, and you have done so by bringing this issue largely placing in the context of our current problems in this country. I will now open the floor for questions and answers, but it will be discussion really because you should be able to make your comments, but I'll kick off while you're mulling over what to say, the discussions by taking the chair's privilege to ask the first question, and this is with regard to the growth of artificial intelligence, the AI, and what is the likelihood of that impacting on this whole issue? Is it going to bring us new challenges? And if so, how is the legal frameworks going to tackle that? Dan?
Artificial intelligence will most probably be helpful in terms of, sorry, there was some, so it will most probably be helpful in terms of hate speech. We know that we have programs or algorithms, as people prefer to call them these days, out there that can intercept in a proactive manner certain words. So, I don't know, what's going on there?
Hello? Excuse me, please.
Because I don't think people can hear. Okay, sorry. We know that artificial intelligence can help intercept certain keywords. And there are programs out there that allow that already. I've been working with the Internet Watch Foundation in the UK for a number of years, especially on child pornography. and they have developed a so-called blacklist of words that if they appear in particular in certain context, and even variations of those words, they will be intercepted by the program, and they will most probably somehow be disseminating child pornography. That exists already. It's existed for a number of years. Interpol uses that. And in terms of hate speech, we have the programs and the capability of doing that already. Of course, sometimes what happens is that the keywords will not represent what the context is really, and that we may target content that shouldn't be targeted, but in general it works. It's very difficult, however, to do it on fake news, because here we don't have keywords that can actually identify the news. I don't believe in that. We have a legal problem in Europe, which is special because we have two court cases in Europe, so-called SABAM case and the Netlock case, that actually say it's illegal to impose upon the Facebooks and the Twitters an obligation to monitor content proactively. That will, however, change now, because 2 weeks ago we had a vote at the European Parliament involving intellectual property rights. And I think I should mention that here, because I think that it's one of the paradoxes that the social media, the YouTubes and the rest of them, really have no problem complying with copyright. In other words, they have been able for some years, and now there is a legal obligation to do so, to identify whether certain works infringe intellectual property right. If you put something up on YouTube and it infringes the right holder for the music or the video, YouTube will take it down immediately. And they even have the capability of identifying that by a so-called uploading filter based on artificial intelligence. I find it very interesting that the same companies that have no problem complying with intellectual property rights and using artificial intelligence to enable that and enforce that do not have the same moral attitude towards human dignity and integrity.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, the floor is now open. I will take questions, comments in twos and threes, perhaps, given this thing. Okay. I'll ask you to identify yourself after I have recognized you, which I have. Zafar will be number 2. This thing will be number 1. So you will identify yourself and your affiliation. So, madam. No, I didn't forget your name, but I wanted you to identify yourself because then it will go into the record.
I'm a historian and social scientist, been teaching in Brussels for many years, and now I'm in Bangladesh for some time. My question or observation is that the response to this sort of problem is likely for governments and states and organizations to come up with what is real news and maybe create a database or archive of such news, and then what would be the impact of trying to enforce that on research. And the fact that research is a tool whereby we are constantly coming up with new information and interpretations. So maybe there's been some thinking.
Is news producers, which would include news organizations such as myself, but as the Honorable Minister had actually mentioned in his address, this is actually nothing new. We have laws in place, and if I print anything in my newspaper which is incorrect, if I print anything which is defamatory, I will be held responsible. It makes sense if one was to do the same thing online. Similar sanctions ought to be think the interesting point is that there are two other categories of possible offenders and how they would be dealt with. One is the individual. For instance, if someone posts something as an individual on Facebook, or even if someone were to share something which is posted by someone, what degree of responsibility, especially legal responsibility, should they be held to? My personal feeling on this is that people should be given the leeway. I think there should be a recognition within any law we have of acting with malice and perhaps acting in mistake. And I think the two things should be very clearly differentiated. There are certain kinds of communication which are clearly malicious. There are others where people may misspeak or they may make a mistake. I hope that that kind of distinction would be made by laws. But the final point is, which I think to be the heart, the crux of what you're talking about, is what do we do with the gatekeepers, the Googles, the Facebooks? And I think you make a very persuasive case that the days of offering them complete immunity, it's an unrealistic, it is just not equal to the challenge which we face in terms of making regulation of the gatekeepers is in specifically the United States. Where do you think legislation in the United States will go in this direction? Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to respond to the...
let's get to all the questions and then...
Okay.
Do you want to do that?
Yeah, you can...
Whatever you... We'll do as Henning says.
You see, all right. So let's take two more questions. Let's take a group of four because otherwise we will look... Yeah. Identify yourself and then affiliation.
I'm C.R. from Department of International Relations, University of Dhaka. That was a fascinating presentation. I just want to know that given your experience, identify sources of fake news. It can be online platforms, it can be individuals. To what extent, government itself, promotes actively or otherwise these fake news. In prosecuting others, taking them for action against those, but, so to say. So, is that you see in different parts of the country, different parts of the world? That's my sort of. Because we others, but the whole, I think that's where the some discussion should take place. Thank you.
Yeah. One more and then...
Okay.
No, I think it's at 4, right?
Yeah. Do you want to speak?
Well, I'll be very specific. The point is that, as we know, currently in Bangladesh, actually, we are worried about, on the international level, two issues. One is the news, fake news and hate speeches which are being made on the what we call the road issue involving Myanmar. And the other is, which is very recent, is during the Indian elections. You see, we see certain speeches are being made, hate speeches, one might say, being distributed, invented, as a matter of fact, which are being protested in political parties in India. Now, I am referring to the is from Assam and West Bengal, which has been on the basis of some fake news and hate speeches are being given. Now, in Bangladesh, we want protection for all. That's very definite. We don't want to practice any jingoistic policy. But what the government and Bangladesh can do in order to stop out these hate speeches and fake news being published and pursued. We all know that these fake news and hate speeches are made in order to make situation conducive for the pursuit of some objective which are not only destructive and heinous. We know what those objectives are, and I think it's very important perhaps that this an effort internationally should also be made in order to step out of this at the very root or at the very beginning. I think that what role internationally the Committee of Nations can play on this is also one of my queries. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Masood,
Okay.
to identify.
Yeah, if you bring up the, is there another
Two more
microphone?
questions and then he will.
Okay.
We need a microphone there.
Yeah, sure, I have one. All right. Masood, go ahead.
Yep.
Quick.
I'll be quick. Thanks for the very very enticing and refreshing, presentation. And one question I had was you mentioned about the regulation that Facebook is trying to implement to protect themselves, similar to what AT&T did. You said long time back, and if you could sort of maybe just get a little bit into in depth if you have time. What kind of regulation they are trying to seek, and sort of what effects it could have if they're able to do this. Another question I had was you mentioned about the internet not having any ownership, sort of like it's everybody's sort of land, kind of a thing. So I just think from my perspective, I have 3 daughters, so they're quite they're very young, 8, 5, and 3. So how do you see the future of the future generations, in 30, 40 years? How this fake news and how it would affect their future and their sort of thinking, and ability to be able to differentiate, and how it would affect maybe the future, our world.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Samia, please.
Okay. So, are there any other who want to ask?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm Samia Zaman. I also work for a television organization and a filmmaker too, journalist. There are just so many things. It would be lovely to have an opportunity to discuss it, but about the first thing that you brought out, a definition, I think, definition of fake news. It's difficult to talk in front of the media, but religion, which category does it go in under? And also, Honorable Minister talked about using, to spread extremist views. Obviously, people who are spreading it, they're thinking of it as something true and right, and they're doing God's work. So how would it be dealt with? Usage of fake news by government agencies. In BBC for a number of years, and I know have been mainstream news organizations playing to the hand of governments and about third world despots here, about major Western powers using news for years through the 60s in the Cold War currently. So what would be done about that? And last of all, Masood talked about his goals. I also have in the family. This is a request to the chairman of Cosmos Foundation and also to the chair that I do not want to see any panel with men only. I've taken photos, and you are Mr. Khan that Bangladesh wants to be at the top of the game, in the leading position. We do need a free panel in government and outside. Always have women, not as a representative quota, but because we are part of the conversation. And this is also about internet, because the access of women to internet, and they are actually the primary target of hate speech, sexualized hate speech, and that's one of the reasons why women find it very difficult. Even women journalists, you just have to go to a website to see the comments that we have a number of women journalists doing political show, which is actually much more in number than what I've seen in UK or US. The kind of hate speech they're targeted with is unbelievable. And last of all, the request to our Honourable Minister is that I don't know if Shambhram Harano is that a legal word or not. I would really request you to use
These women were raped in the war. যুদ্ধে ধর্ষিত হয়েছে। তারা বীরাঙ্গনা, তারা মুক্তিযোদ্ধা এখন স্বীকৃত। সুতরাং is a very you know what it is. We want clear definition of things and the way it should be portrayed, and that would be my request, of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Points well made and noted. I'll give you the floor first. You have a full plate on your hands, and then I'll give the floor to the Honourable Minister. Oh, well, the point she has made. Okay.
I'll try to group some of the questions together, so it may not be necessarily in the sequence asked. But I will start with you, however, and just say that in terms of databases and the collection of historical records of maybe what may or may not be fake news, I was actually just 2 weeks ago at a conference in Milan in Italy, organized by the European Commission, working on such an effort. Is called cross-check, and it allows newspapers, I don't know whether any Bangladesh-based newspapers are part of it, but maybe you should consider that, of sharing such information as to content which may or may not be fake. They use what they call IT forensics, which is developing science, which allows, for instance, to identify whether videos and images have been photoshopped, when they were taken, that kind of thing, and that can help a lot because a lot of the fake news around is really pretty primitive in terms of forensics. So it's a good idea, and I would certainly suggest that you look at maybe joining that initiative, which so far as I know, is only European. Cross-check. I'll be glad to share it with you. The other question was, I think the very, very important question is what's going on in the US. That was your question. I'm afraid that the answer that I will give is not the answer that I would like to give. I spoke at the American Bar Association conference in February in Miami. The Bar Association conference, all the lawyers working for the CNNs, the Facebook, and they were also there, by the way, judges and prosecutors working on free speech. And so I was the token European defending a position that was not 100% free speech dogmatic. And I survived, and they were very proud. But unfortunately, the free speech religion is very, very strong in the US. From either side of the aisle, the political parties depend so much on funding from the tech community, from Silicon Valley, that even though, for instance, Elizabeth Warren has now come out and said that she would fight the monopoly control of the tech titans, I'm afraid that not much will happen there. She's a very courageous woman. I would give her all the moral support I can, but it's not the way I see things happening. On the contrary, the latest news I have on that is that the treaty, the US MCA, the trade treaty between the US, Mexico, and Canada, which was signed off in November by Donald Trump, includes in Article 19, Section 12, you may want to check it, Article 19, Section 12, an obligation on the partners, that is on Mexico and on Canada, and I hope it won't happen to this country if and when you will be negotiating a treaty with the US, that Mexico and Canada must accept the absolute immunity provision in the US. Did you just hear what you heard? It's completely unheard of. In a trade agreement, that one country imposes its values on another country? Have you ever heard of that before? I mean, trade agreements, that's like customs and tariffs, right? But in there, check it out, Section 1912. 17, sorry. And in the European position on that is that they are not going to include digital trade in the new agreement. I'm just voicing this as a concern that you should be aware of here because it's going to come. So the policy of the US is the Silicon Valley establishment is too strong politically, and it is the opposite of what I would like to say. They are not caving in on the country. They are exporting their absolute immunity rule to other countries. If you want to do business with the US, you have to accept that. That's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? And that brings me automatically to the questions raised here in terms of international cooperation, and I like very much the state-sponsored fake news. We have a word for state-sponsored fake news. It's propaganda. And people tend to forget. Actually, when we talk about fake news, I would say that there are three categories of it. There is the fake news that we all know about, that we're talking about without being able to define it. We more or less intuitively know what it is. And then there's the state-sponsored, which is propaganda. And then there is the third category, which we should talk about 2 minutes, which is astroturfing. Does anybody know what that is, astroturfing? You know. Astroturfing is fake news affecting business. This is very important. I've had a number of cases where fake news is used as a competitive advantage, disparaging your competitor. There are cases where you can actually erode the market value of a company by floating information that's malicious, that's completely fake, but people believe it. Stockholders believe it. Banks believe it. And just imagine the kind of information that you could float about a company that violates the labor laws in this particular country, Bangladesh. We've seen that. We all know some of the textile manufacturers that have done terrible things in this country, and they should rightly be affected by that on their reputation. But we've also seen others that haven't, and they're accused of having. So we need to be very, very, very careful also with the fake news that affects the business environment, because we want the best product at the best price to win. And we don't want the guy who's best as disparaging the other to win, do we? No. So I'm afraid that if we go back to the category which is the one we mentioned here, which is propaganda, and also address the question at the same time of international cooperation, we have a treaty. We do have a treaty. People seem to have forgotten, because that treaty was actually signed during the League of Nations, which, as you all know, was before the United Nations, between the two world wars. This is the Treaty of 1936, which talks about propaganda. And, well, unfortunately, it didn't stop the biggest propaganda machine in history, which is that of Goebbels, in inciting the worst hatred we've seen in history. But it's there. And it's still in full force and effect, but people have forgotten about it. Now, this treaty institutes a principle that I would really say that we should revisit, which is the principle of the country of origin. We have that principle in another area which is pretty new. We have it on in the audiovisual directive in broadcasting. Of course, in the day of 1936, we didn't have the internet. It was all broadcasting. So if you had a radio station that was inciting hatred or whatever it was in another country, then the first country where the broadcaster was and is based could be responsible for the second country under international law. Now, so far, we haven't had a case before the International Court of Justice, because that would be the forum, because it's a UN instrument involving the 1936 treaty. But I've been arguing for several years now that this is the principle we should apply also on the internet. In other words, the country that allows on its territory someone, a person or a company, to spread hateful content inciting rebellion, hatred, genocide in another country, that first country should be responsible. It's negligent in not enforcing its obligations under international public law. Of course, we know of one country in particular, which is the US, that would say that they would not accept that, because they would say it violates a constitutional right, which is the First Amendment. Yet, on the other hand, I think that on this particular point, after what we saw originating in Macedonia or in Russia, they may be a bit more open to that. And by the way, on the 20th of April last year, the Democratic National Party actually sued before the First Circuit the Russian Federation, together with the Donald Trump Jr. election campaign. This latter thing they shouldn't have done before getting the Mueller report. But they did sue the Russian Federation. It's a very interesting case. In my opinion, they should have done it before the International Court of Justice. So, in terms of international treaty, we just need to apply to the internet. Just like McCain said that the Honest Ad Act, which applies to media, should also apply to the internet. And this brings me to the last point, which is the advertisers. When we look at who is and who should be accountable, we know that the advertisers, in actual fact, they don't like bad press. They're not advertising in order to get bad press, quite on the contrary. We need to make them accountable if they, from a legal point of view, if they know that putting ads on this particular site actually funds that site. And you know, everybody in this room, I think, will understand that among the different remedies that I have mentioned today, the 50 million fine, the 4% fine, and the rest, this one is going to be the most effective. If Procter & Gamble, #1 advertiser in the world, and Unilever, #2, in a market of $2 trillion, decide that they are no longer going to fund hate speech, sexism, just to address your point, fake news and so on, it will disappear by itself, because the business model is the problem and the business model is the solution.
Dr. Murshid's point, have you addressed?
Which was
The first one, Hazin Murshid.
Yes, that was cross-checked. That was that was Milan. I think that was also the question, right, of the international.
Yes.
I think there was religion, maybe. Religion was mentioned.
Yeah, there was a point
Religion.
on religion. Yes.
I should mention that the Genocide Convention from 1948, which was the first convention dealing with this sort of thing under the United Nations auspices, includes religious beliefs and persecution on the basis of religious belief. So we have international treaties in there, and we have that in the Rwanda case, where it was indeed also of ethnic and religious discrimination that led to genocide.
Thank you. My name is Sakhawat Ali Khan. I am from Dhaka University. I am a retired professor, and now I am honorary, as they call it. Anyway, I think you will kindly allow me to be bilingual, because the minister, honorable minister, has spoken in Bangla, and all other deliberations are in English. Anyway, so the first thing is this, that the minister has said that the technology should be confronted with technology. It's all right. Technology, but Bangladesh, is ready to have a sort of a confrontation with the world system that is being developed. And moreover, it's a criminal act, and it's a world problem. And what should be the nature of cooperation? Will there be a sort of a international commission or a sort of a consortium to help it, that how to come out of this problem? Because the technology is going faster than human thought, actually. So technology to be confronted should be done with a new system, not this one. This one should be done. We should forget about this system that we have. So naturally, my question to the minister, যে আপনি যে বলেন যে আমরা কনফ্রন্ট করব, তো এই বাংলাদেশের পক্ষে একা তো এটা করা কিছুতেই সম্ভব নয়। কাজেই এখন বাংলাদেশের পক্ষে তো এখন কি করে, এবং আমার সমস্ত এক্ষেত্রে এগিয়ে তাদের সঙ্গে কিভাবে অপারেশনে আমরা যেতে পারি বাংলাদেশ, সেটা একটা বড় প্রশ্ন। আর তাছাড়া যে হেড স্পিচ বলি বলি, এটা কিন্তু ইন্টারন্যাশনালি হচ্ছে। আমি অত্যন্ত দুঃখের সঙ্গে বলতে বাধ্য হচ্ছি, অনেক বড় দেশের একেবারে রাষ্ট্রপ্রধানরা যে ধরনের কথাবার্তা বলেন এবং যে সমস্ত তাদের আচার আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি, তাতে আর যাই হোক, বাংলাদেশের আমাদের রাজনীতিকদের তেমন কিছু শেখার নাই তাদের কাছে। আমি এখন চাচ্ছি যে সারা পৃথিবীতে একসঙ্গে কিছু করা যায় কিনা। এইভাবে আমার মনে হয় যে এইভাবে ওই ঢাকা বসে আমরা কিছু একটা সেমিনার করলাম, তাতে করে এই ধরনের এত বড় বিশ্ব প্রবলেমকে, এত বড় সমস্যাকে আমরা অ্যাড্রেস করতে পারবো কিনা আমার যথেষ্ট সন্দেহ আছে। সো the question is both to the Prime Minister, the Minister and to Mr. Dan Shafat.
Very good.
Thank you.
We'll have two more. Did you want to, Ambassador Islam? Okay. Then after you, then Junaid Chowdhury.
আমার নাম আমি লিবারেটিং ফর গ্রোথ এমপ্লয়মেন্ট অ্যান্ড গভর্নেন্সের কমিউনিকেশন স্পেশালিস্ট, ওয়ার্ল্ড ব্যাংকের প্রজেক্ট। আমার বিশ্ব যে যেটা ছড়ানো হচ্ছে, বিশেষ করে নির্বাচন কেন্দ্রিক যে কম্পিউটেশনাল প্রোপাগান্ডা তৈরি হয় এবং সেটা সৃষ্টি করা হয়, সেই যে এটা হলো ইমার্জিং টেকনোলজি, এআই এন্ড আইওটি, এগুলো ব্যবহার করা হয়। আর একটি হচ্ছে যে নির্দিষ্ট মালিকানা ব্ল্যাক বক্স ব্যবহার করা হয়। সুতরাং এই টেকনোলজিক্যাল যে আমার বলেছেন শাখা হচ্ছে আর অনেকটা, তো সেই যে এখানে সৃষ্টি ছিল বা ক্রিয়েটিভিটি দিয়েই সেটাকে মোকাবেলা করতে হবে, সেই পরিকল্পনা করছেন। ধন্যবাদ। মাননীয় মন্ত্রীকে প্রশ্ন।
My name is it working? Okay, my name is Junaid Chowdhury, and I don't know how to describe myself, but as I was mentioning a little earlier, with due apologies to...
Thought leader about town. Okay.
With due apologies to the minister, I was saying that there are some fake persons in this audience, and I happen to be one of them. I don't know whether we should discuss this point, but as Monsieur Shafat was saying, that the one difficulty is to decide who decides. Now, we have a recent instance that the Prime Minister of Canada, he sacked two of his female colleagues. What I understand is because they were spreading fake news. He didn't say it, he said it's lack of trust, but I think they were, the whistleblowers or whatever it is, they were saying fake news. So he thought it was that they were doing fake news. Now, who is to decide? That's my comment. Okay.
Okay. This is the Huawei case?
Yeah, okay, one more.
Yeah, just a follow-up question. Willem van der Geest, I'm a political economist. I've worked for the EU as well as for the UN. And I'm looking at this question of regulation, the gatekeeper. So the European principle doesn't seem to be enough anymore to control or, what should I say, manage the dominance of these very big tech companies. Do you see a solution such that companies like Facebook are not dominating the whole world industry, or Google, etc.?
Oh, yeah, okay. I think so. Yeah, first I did not address, and I'm sorry, two questions asked in the first round, which was what about the future for our children? But I think it's very, very important. And unfortunately, the statistics I have, they are not very comforting, because 87% of Generation Z, all right, we talk about the millennials, they're about 35 years old, and Generation Z would be those that were born in year 2000, so they are not even 20. And 87% of the news that they get, this is from the US, all right, comes from Facebook, all right. They don't even watch TV any longer. The TV they watch is the phone. And I'm afraid that your question is terribly pertinent. Now, what to do about that, apart from education, is a proposal that actually I made to the Singaporean government, because I was called to testify before the parliamentary committee headed up by Mr. Shanmugam, the Justice Minister, on what they call deliberate falsehoods, which is a very nice way of talking about fake news, that we should, in general, drop the terminology for certain news, which is not manifestly fake, and talk about disputed news instead. And calling upon the user community, which is especially the young people, that were into this technology that, I mean, some of us in this room, we remember what it was like before the internet, but they never experienced anything before the internet. So they brought that, and that they should be part of controlling this cyberspace in such a way that they should be actively accountable. In other words, when they spot something that may be toxic, I use this term because it covers hate speech and fake news, that they should report it, and that it should be easy to report it. And when you arrive at, say, 10,000, I'm just giving an arbitrary number here, over a period of time which could be 24 hours, and if you have 10,000 people within a certain territory that over 24 hours, independently one of the other, flag the same content as something that they dispute, then automatically, and that algorithm already exists with Facebook. I've met some of the people from Facebook, from public policy, they confirm it exists. Then it will automatically tag that news for anybody who sees it after that, saying that it's disputed.
Is the trolling, is it?
Well, no, it actually is that you see something on the internet and you don't believe it's true, and you think that it may have a manipulative impact, so you simply press a button, and that exists already. It could be very easy to use, and it'll automatically say that you are disputing this. If 10,000 people, independently of each other, so we won't allow robots to do it, or bots, do the same thing, then henceforth, that bit of news will travel through the internet, and it'll be tagged as disputed. And the idea is that we won't use a terminology saying that it's fake, because that would need somebody to decide it's fake, but that the user community would be actively involved in spotting and calling to attention, and that therefore this new generation, which will be born into the system, will see, okay, this is disputed, maybe I should check it out. This is one of the ways that we hope, because with 87% of all Generation Z in the US getting their news from Facebook, and it's going to be the same in this country tomorrow, we got to do something about it. I totally agree. Now, you about actually breaking up the monopoly, because that is really what it is. I mentioned Elizabeth Warren, who's been very brave in doing that in the European Union, and I know that you know that. That is why you asked the question. We have Margaret Vestager, who is the commissioner in charge of competition law, who has already fined Google 3 times. Now she's coming down with a 4th case, and there's a 5th case pending. The fines have reached 4 billion euros. So this is, again, big money we're talking about for that dominant position. Now, the problem from a legal point of view is that we don't have in Europe a Sherman Act like they have in the US from 1890. We cannot break up a company simply because it monopolizes. We can only condemn abuse of that monopoly under Article 102. So the breakup as such will only be necessary if the abuse becomes systemic to the monopoly. In the US, on the other hand, they could break it up because they have monopolization as a crime, which is policed by the Department of Justice under the Sherman Act. And of course, nobody has the guts, apart from maybe Elizabeth Warren, to do that. There is a very important contribution recently by a professor at Columbia University, Tim Wu, who calls for revisiting the Sherman Act and applying that to the internet. I don't know whether it'll fly or not. The theory is that the control as such is not hurtful to the consumer because the products and the services are free, and that the Sherman Act only applies to consumer protection. Of course, the other theory is that that is no longer true. The Sherman Act is also political, so that it includes certain obligations to respect democratic values and so on and so forth. But I got to be fair to say that you can't find that in the Sherman Act. If you read that, it was before Brandeis and Theodore Roosevelt. You don't find that explicitly in the Sherman Act. So I don't go to pass the Supreme Court in the U.S. But in Europe, we just find each and every abuse.
Yeah, might I flag just one thing? You see, some of the discussion is about the general nature of these issues, and there have been sort of hints at some kind of a global understanding, global treaty. But the problem is, many of these countries, in most countries, the municipal law supersedes the international law. Yeah. So that remains a very big issue. So you have to have a law in your own territory in the sovereign state in order to implement it.
Yeah, I think that what we really need, because we've been looking at international cooperation, and the more we look at this problem, the more we understand that international cooperation is necessary. Otherwise, it'll just be a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, because we can't stop. And I think what we really need in terms of international cooperation is obliging corporate entities to respect human rights. As you probably all know, the traditional legal theory under public international law, and therefore under the human rights treaties as an example, is that it is only the states that are obligated parties, not corporations. The Professor Reyes, a US professor, renowned professor, came out with a report on corporate responsibility to respect human rights. It only amounted to guidelines in the United Nations. Ecuador in 2013 moved for a UN resolution saying that the obligation for corporations, transnational corporations, to respect human rights should be revisited. In a country again like Bangladesh, the horrific events that we saw in the textile industry would not have applied if the ILO treaties had applied to the multinationals in question. I find it completely unacceptable today, certainly today, when these corporations wield more power, not only financial power, but also more political power than most sovereign states, that they are not subject to respect human rights obligations. This is what we need, and once we have imposed corporate liability from a legal point of view to comply with human rights, we've done a great giant step for mankind, referring to Armstrong again.
Thank you very much. Okay, the minister slightly is pressed for time, so he will have to leave, unfortunately. So I will give him the floor now, because a couple of remarks were also addressed to him, and also I would request him to wrap up in the way he deems fit.
Thank you for the questions first. I'll answer the first question first. You see, the use of the word Shambro. I must take you back to 1972, that is immediately after our independence. The word rape was not thought to be a very polite word. It was actually thought to be a very rude word. And that is why, when respecting these ladies who had lost or who had been raped, this word was coined from the Bengali dictionary, Shambro. We have been using that. You have called for a definition, but usage, it has now become such that it is more or less equaled with the word raped. But that does not answer the question. Now things have moved forward. Now the entire nation has started respecting them for what has happened. And I think we can at times use, we must be sure of one thing, not offending the people whom we are talking about. And you see, if in a discussion we use the word raped, I think that will be very out of context, or because they have been raped. But that recognition has been given now, so we can start changing it. But the use of word Shambro, I think in public speech, that should be kept. That's my personal opinion, whether one agrees with it or not, because করবেন কিনা সেটা অডিয়েন্স বুঝে ব্যবহার করা উচিত। I have been able to satisfy you, but this is my opinion. The second question, kintu, in my speech I have actually separated it in three parts. One was what the government is doing at this point of time. The government has taken up the task of enacting the Digital Security Act. It has, of course, in line with the Digital Security Act, it has come up with the codes necessary, the infrastructure necessary to protect it. Then we are coming up with the policy of registering the online portals. And we are also working on a guideline. I guess once that is there, we will be able to at least stop the internal use of fake news and things like that. Now, I have talked about technology development in a global context. It's not that I have said that Bangladesh should develop it. Yes, Bangladesh is part of the globe, and Bangladesh should try and develop it. But again, at the end of my speech, I have said that combating fake news needs getting together of the global committee. And that is why international level we have to work, because these are all trans-border crimes. For example, I talk about the money laundering laws. You see, because of the umbrella ship of the United Nations, we have been able to enact the work I'm talking about. I'm talking about it in a global context. We have been able to come up with the Money Laundering Act, which has uniformity all over the world. And also, with it, we have come up with the system called the Mutual Legal Assistance System, which is again an act, the Mutual Legal Assistance Act, which compels us to share it with the international committee, with other countries. And through cooperation like that, I guess we will be able to combat this. And as you have seen, when was speaking in the Congress in the United States, he said that regulations are required, but what kind of regulations will be in place, that needs to be discussed. So what we are trying now is we are looking forward to such discussions, will be dictated by what the international committee does about it. We belong to that, and to combat it, we have to have cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. So the Honourable Minister will be taking his leave. Might I request that he'll be given a crest? Yes. So let's wrap it up then. Okay, all right. We will, in a minute or so, I want to thank everyone for their interventions, and particularly the speakers. We will now have a very small ceremony, award of crests to the speakers, and then we will call it a day, and the MC will probably take the floor to invite you to lunch, will you not, MC? Okay. So, all right, shall we stand then?
Now, Tanzina, please, we're going to give the crest to our chief guest, Mr. Anisul Haq.
We have a group picture. Group picture. No, you should come.
Now to our special guest, Mr. Dan Sheffett.
And one for our chair.
And one for our chair, Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Chaudhry.
Sorry. without anything in our hand, I think we forward versus put it up.
Very, very rich discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you. Lunch will be served on the rooftop. So on the 11th floor. After 10, you have to walk up one stair.